So like you mentioned, Sahar, I lead our decarbonization efforts at APM Terminals, which consists of 65 terminals across many countries across the globe. I have been with the company for now a couple of years since I started this role. And before that, right before that, I basically spent most of the last decade on topics of energy transition and decarbonization of countries and hard to abate sectors. Activities, the main activities in the terminal are those basically activities associated with lifting and transporting, moving these fairly gigantic and heavy boxes around, which are done by a variety of machines, and think of them as specialized vehicles, cranes, and those are essentially the main source of emissions. And they come in different varieties depending on the performance that's expected of them. Some are as simple as what trucks that you basically see on roads, but slightly specialized, we call them terminal trucks. Some are a little bit more specialized in terms of the actual activity that they do. Now, while some of these machines are already electrified, so basically plugged in because of their nature of either being stationary or really rail mounted, they can be plugged in and they're at a more mature state of electrification. A vast majority of them still need to be electrified, and because of the mobility that they have, they most likely will have to be through solutions such as battery electric or fuel cell hydrogen, and you name it. So that's essentially where the emissions come from. And I'm sorry, I perhaps look where the emissions come from the diesel. That's these machines, the ones that are not electrified, they're essentially the energy source today is predominantly diesel. Now, of course, that is just the machines that move the containers. In the port ecosystem, you of course have the vessels at berth, who also actually generate way more emissions than any one of these machines. But that would be the source of emissions in the terminal. Now, which we technically call Scope 1, so direct emissions from burning diesel on site, but also for all those other equipment that are already electrified, of course, depending on the source of the electricity, there's a Scope 2 emission that can be associated with them.
Right. And so how does this compare? What's the footprint of APM terminals compared to the overall AP Møller-Mærsk?
So of course it varies by year depending on, how many terminals we operate and how much we operate and what are the running hours of these machines. But you could say roughly we're talking about Scope 1 and 2 of APM terminals, we're talking about 500,000 ton. Which frankly in the context of maritime industry, and especially compared for instance with our sister company, Maersk Ocean, is actually tiny. It's less than 1%. But the point that I'd like to make, because we've actually done, and you mentioned the paper earlier, and we're going to get to it in a bit, because we've actually quantified this at a high level for the industry to get a sense of what is really at stake. And what we say is basically we're talking about emissions of, potentially a country such as Slovenia. The point, though, is that the levers to decarbonize are way more mature, are much more accessible and cheaper than what you would need to actually decarbonize shipping. So in that sense, whatever we can deploy and scale will help also the harder to abate sectors, and will also help us to start or actually stop and mitigate eating into the limited carbon budget that we have. Right. So in that sense, even though small, the point that we are raising is that there is no reason to actually if shipping is a little bit more difficult and we're waiting for certain technologies to mature, that shouldn't stop us from taking action on the terminals front.
Yeah. Every step counts, and everything can make a difference. And of course, APM Terminals is also part of the wider AP Møller Maersk,
Absolutely.
part of the overall commitment that we have made towards net zero in 2040. And we also have 2030 targets for APM terminals. So when you talk about, let's say, the overall, you've highlighted the key lever, or at least a main lever to decarbonize in terms of switching from diesel to electrification of equipment. What other pillars what are the other key pillars of your strategy for decarbonization?
Very good question. Just as a reminder, our scope 2 is actually, because you mentioned main, given that a lot of the large cranes that we have on the quay side, where they actually unload and load the vessels, those are actually running already on electricity. A good portion of our overall emissions, roughly 40%, are actually scope 2. So we can already do a lot actually by just making sure that that electricity is renewables, from renewable sources. So that is one lever. But let me give you the full fledged sort of list of levers. In a way, it's very simple. Like literally every other sector, or even if you want to net zero your own house, these are the three ways to go about it. Energy efficiency, so minimizing basically demand and minimizing and taking out waste as much as possible. And this can be done by things as simple as switching to LEDs, all sorts of operational efficiency, basically levers, which we are doing. And the beauty of these levers is that they often have a very attractive business case and very quick payback times. Then the second lever is actually replacing assets. So all those cranes and vehicles that we talked about, replacing those from diesel to electric. In our case, that is broadly the strategy. And then finally making sure that electricity that we actually procure is from renewables sources. Underneath that lever, there are terminals where we also use biofuels, HVO, where it makes sense. So that you can generally call it decarbonizing the energy source, but we are predominantly talking about decarbonizing the electricity with the third pillar.
And before I go into the next question, just want to remind also our listeners, our followers, viewers today to also please jump in with your questions along the way. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So when it comes to these pillars for decarbonization, what do you think overall? We'll get to the white paper in just a second, but overall, what are some of the key challenges that you face then in progressing on that strategy?
So let's start with the easier challenges, which are actually more related to scope 2. So in ensuring that we actually procure 100% of our electricity from renewables resources, we really have no technological problem there, right? We're essentially talking about solar and wind predominantly. Those are mature, highly competitive technologies as it stands. And we are actually about 40% of our electricity today is already sourced from renewables electricity. Though this is in markets that naturally this is available to us. So the first challenge that we face there, even though the technology is really mature, there are a whole host of geographies and countries where the regulatory environment doesn't allow, for instance, for a corporate power purchase agreement. So that is the main challenge there, to make sure that then the right developers develop these projects and actually offer them so that we can meet our targets. Then when we talk about scope 1, you've got a sort of slightly more tricky problems over there. But to start with, there's an element of affordability. Just the green premiums are high, they're disproportionately high.
It's more expensive.
It's more
compared to
expensive.
the
So
diesel.
electricity is more than diesel, which is natural. That is what happens in general with every new technology you have versus the incumbent technology in the beginning, and before it scales up, you have a premium. In our case, and we've covered this in the paper, what we see is actually a fairly high green premium, which is predominantly due to the cost of batteries. There, that is one problem, because making sure that these business cases actually make sense and be able to deploy at scale, we need to see how we can bring down the cost as soon as possible. Then we also have infrastructure issues. There are places where if you want to electrify, either there is no reliable grid. There are certain geographies where even for the more mature assets that we just talked about, you can't even plug in. So it's not just a matter of batteries, but the grid is not available, a reliable grid to actually put electric equipment on it. And there are other places where right now it's okay for the plug-in basically vehicles and cranes, but to be able to massively ramp up and electrify the existing assets, you actually need to make sure that you've got enough capacity from the grid.
Right.
So those are the two. I mean, I invite our audience also to look at the paper, but those are the two that I would highlight here. Yeah. The machines being expensive and the readiness of the grid.
Right. And now we've alluded a little bit to the white paper a couple of times.
Yes.
Let's get to that, and let's talk about. So this is a new initiative from APM Terminals. Tell us, what is the white paper about, and why did you decide to launch it?
Good question. So, about a year ago, we actually, after really testing and studying our own portfolio of terminals, talking with a lot of suppliers, looking at actually product availability, costs, and so on. And it wasn't just a study, we actually started 5 electrification pilots around the world to deploy these machines, not 1 or 2, but a whole operational unit actually, to see how it works in reality. But then all of those interactions actually gave us a whole set of insights, which and it became clear to us that it was important to actually put these facts and figures out there beyond the study that we did internally for ourselves. And the reason for that being, one, there was a recurring question around hydrogen. And we wanted to really have a fact-based and research-based answer around that. And 2, what we saw was that the premiums were high and they weren't coming down fast enough. So again, what the paper was about, it's essentially around doing an analysis of how far we are from the tipping point. And by tipping point, we mean when basically the electric solutions become cheaper than diesel-run solutions, and what can we do to expedite and basically bring that tipping point closer to now. So that was the reason.
So based on learnings from pilot projects in APM Terminals, then the idea of the white paper is to share these learnings to have a more fact-based.
What I would say is that the paper, that was the initial basically reason for it. But we really wanted the paper to be applicable and be more of an outside-in picture of the world, as not only us, but also other operators and other stakeholders see it.
Right.
So what you see in the paper is more of a lay of the land as anybody who is actually in the system would see it, rather than sharing exclusively our own basically experience. So that was the original reason around the white paper, and what we knew was that to get over those challenges, we are too small. We are one party. We are committed. You talked about the targets. We have laid the targets. We have very detailed plans, not only at corporate level, but per terminal. But to be able to really move the needle, we need more collaboration.
Yes.
We need other port operators. We just talked about the stakeholders. We need port authorities. We need our suppliers to actually come together and look at some of the basically levers that we have discussed in the paper. And what we found was, and we look at 2 or 3 different types of assets. I'm not going to get into details there, but there were essentially 3 levers. There were 3 ways that we could expedite. What we found was that tipping points are roughly between 2 to 8 years. So that parity, that tipping point can actually happen in this decade. If those actions are taken to basically, one, put out more demand out there, so scale up, because right now the orders are too small, and of course the suppliers don't get enough of a strong enough demand signal, to standardize and modularize around battery specs, battery charging infrastructure or software, and finally reduce downtime.
Right.
Because what happens when you have a battery similar to your EV is that the time that the machine is out and being charged, you basically will need to have an extra machine to be running in that time. So that just adds up to the overall cost. So those were basically the levers that we laid out in the paper, and then a concrete set of actions for ourselves, for our suppliers, for port authorities, for shipping lines, on what each of these stakeholders can actually do to make sure that that tipping point happens as soon as possible.
So it's laying out the facts, but I guess it's also a call to action, right?
Absolutely.
To get collaboration, everyone involved. And what are the steps then that you are taking to collaborate with, I guess in particular, ports and government authorities to drive this forward?
Indeed. So the paper was the excuse to get started. It was really just a starting point to also encourage the conversation happening on a fact and research-based method. What we have done and are doing as we speak are basically talking to a whole host of parties. Actually, some of them had already endorsed the paper 5 weeks ago. DP World is actually on board, who's one of the other port operators. We had Port of Rotterdam on board. So, and that continues. That we had, those initial parties, that is happening as we speak. And we actually have an event next week during COP where we are going to talk more about what we have done since then, since launching the paper. And the idea is that we get those parties on board and actually see to what extent we can explore bringing those actions and those outcomes to life in the next 12 to 18 months. So what we are looking for is actually fairly fast and time-bound set of actions.
I'll be very excited to follow. Though there's a good question here from Kunal from India. He's asking, how are employees being trained and reskilled to make APM terminals reach its goal faster for decarbonization?
That's an excellent question. And I would say we are on a journey on that. And this needs to happen at different levels as well. Earlier I talked about the pilots. One of the main reasons of these pilots are actually to learn how the operations, safety, maintenance manuals, and working procedures actually need to be updated and upgraded, and as a result be incorporated into the certifications and competencies that actually our frontline colleagues need to have to be able to run or work in an environment that is essentially fully electric, and that with batteries. But beyond that, there are really every level of the organization you need to have almost bespoke training. One of the other initiatives that we've had in the last couple of years were terminal-specific decarbonization roadmaps. So we would basically go and work with parties from a terminal, be it the terminal CEO and their leadership team, so finance, maintenance, operations, and actually with the team together lay out what needs to happen in the terminal so that they are actually at target come 2040. And that process itself, I think, and them being in the driving seat, I think was also a good training and change management process.
Exactly.
But those are just two examples, and overall we're working on those to be able to actually go further.
But I think it's a good reminder also that, we talk about the technologies needed, but it also comes down to people,
Absolutely.
right? And changing processes and the business. So there's another good question coming in here from Mika. How does the electrification strategy impact the electricity grid of the area where the port is?
So if you look at just the terminal, in general, it will impact, and it will impact it materially. And that, again, depends a little bit on how old the grid is, what is really the available capacity. There are terminals and geographies in the world where we have electrified, and basically the infrastructure is fine or will be fine. Whereas there are places where, and this is roughly, as a rule of thumb, we say that for a lot of the existing terminals, for a fully electric end state, you're talking about roughly doubling the electricity demand. And often you would actually need an infrastructure and substation and distribution grid upgrade locally to be able to actually get that electricity and with the right reliability and quality that you will need for actually battery electric equipment. So I guess the short answer is it will affect it, depends on the current state. And like I said earlier, it is actually deemed as one of the challenges because the terminals are only one piece of the puzzle in the broad port ecosystem. You've got every other business and sector also in the same environment electrifying. So overall, and I think this is not news, there are numerous research and opinion pieces about it on how much we actually need to do in different countries as a society to actually upgrade the grid to be able to accommodate the electrification at the right pace.
It's so critical, and actually, I mean, that goes both for APM Terminals specifically, it goes for our wider MASC strategy as well, that ultimately all businesses and sectors are so dependent on investments in renewable electricity. We're coming close to the end of our time, so and maybe just also to make sure, if you want to make sure that people know where they can find more information about the white paper, and any final points you want to make.
So the white paper, I hope it should be easy to find if you just search for APM Terminals, APMT white paper. So we've got a dedicated page to it. Let us know in the comments if that's not the case, and then we should fix it. But otherwise, to your point around a key message. So first of all, for those of the audience who are actually either interested or happen to be one of the stakeholders that I mentioned, if you would like to get engaged and be involved, please contact us, because we are actually looking to mobilize the ecosystem. That is ultimately the objective, to expedite the cost down. But on a more general note, what I would say is that our mantra in doing this paper and the work that we are doing has been to actually basically take out the unnecessary complexities. What we say is that the stuff that are easy, like terminal decarbonization, let's just get on with it and scale at speed, and not overly get it convoluted with other sectors, especially in the context of maritime decarbonization. Right. So that would be, I guess, the message that I'd love to leave the audience with, to really make the supposedly easy to abate sectors truly easy, and not overly complicated.
That's a great place to end. I think it definitely shows that there are steps that we can take, and we're taking them, and we're also reaching out to stakeholders to get them involved on the journey. If there are any questions we haven't managed to cover, we'll definitely try to do so online. And for now, just want to say thank you very much to those of you who listened in. Thank you so much, and have a great day.